All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming here this morning. The panel is entitled California Asia, the Need for Collaboration. What this really means, and the reason this topic is actually relevant, is that you're dealing with the interactions of what is, by various metrics, the world's sixth largest economy in California, and is certainly a place that is viewed as the world center of design, the world center of innovation, and a place with a much greater footprint in terms of its impact and connections to the world than this simple population would suggest. More importantly than that, what you're dealing with the fact is that fundamentally, the world's largest center of population, the world's largest, the largest share of the global economy, and indeed the key to the world's economic, social, political future is Asia. And the gateway between the United States and Asia is fundamentally California. If you happen to be in Seattle or Portland, you might argue a little bit, but the fact remains that California is culturally, economically, socially, technologically, and educationally the gateway. California not only is one of the greatest centers of education for the world, we educate a significant portion of the world's leading scientists, the world's leading politicians, the world's leading business leaders and entrepreneurs, but we also increasingly have developed a connection where we fundamentally need those connections. And Asia fundamentally views that relationship with California, whether in mind you, we're talking about a very broad space, but the connections not simply just to China, which gets the most attention, but to South Korea, to Singapore, to Japan, to Indonesia, to Thailand. The list goes on, and those connections are fundamental in terms of coming up with some of the key ideas and the key people behind those ideas and the companies with those ideas that are shaping our world. Today we have we are having our panel in the wake of a new administration in Washington. We've got some major issues in terms of what the future of trade is in the wake of the rejection of the Trans-Pacific Partnership by the White House, and the rise of new trade agreements and collaboration by the Chinese, in many cases trying to fill that void. How does that affect us? How does that affect the individuals in Asia who fundamentally want to engage and their economies as well? With us we have four very disparate but very skilled viewpoints. Immediately over on my far right, on your far left, is Fred Hochberg, who's the immediate former chairman and president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States. Fred brings not only his perspective from government, but also his perspective as the former dean of the Milano School of International Affairs at the New School, and deputy administrator of the SBA, and even more than that, he also used to run his family business, Lillian Vernon, which means that if you need to have the perfect gift, Fred is your man.
Well, it used to be.
Yeah. Well, okay, it would be the perfect gift 20 years ago, but it'll still be a perfect gift. Elise Huang is the CEO of NOAA US and the managing partner of Gopher Asset Management. NOAA is actually the largest wealth management platform in China with over $70 billion of assets under advisory. And Gopher Asset is the private equity venture capital arm of NOAA Holdings with over $17 billion of assets under management. So in her current role, she not only oversees the U.S. business for NOAA and Gopher, but she previously was the U.S. partner of West Summit Capital, and I will note for the record is somebody who truly understands the United States, and the reason I can say that is because she has an MBA from the University of Dubuque in Iowa. So if she has survived a winter in Iowa, she understands the United States. So, and then to my immediate left is Pradeep Khosla, who is the Chancellor of University of California, San Diego, which I will note for the record is in the top 50 world research universities, both in the Times of London and in the Shanghai Institute rankings. He is not only a distinguished academic leader, but he is an electrical and computer engineer who previously served as Dean of Engineering at Carnegie Mellon. And so that being said, he also understands America, having survived a Pittsburgh winter.
Oh, come on.
All right, fine. I'm in the California perspective, and let's be honest.
That's true.
Let's be honest, is that the fact that you could survive a Pittsburgh winter, you can survive an Indian summer, and I think you can survive most every environment.
That's true.
Ashok Kumar Mirpuri is the ambassador of the Republic of Singapore to the United States. He's been the ambassador for 4.5 years, since July 2012. He was previously the ambassador from Singapore to Indonesia from 2006 to 2012, and High Commissioner from Malaysia before that, in Australia before that. So he truly is the man that Singapore trusts, considering he's been nice enough to be here with us and previously was with Singapore's two principal neighbors. He's also, in addition to his education at the National University of Singapore, also received an MA at the University of London and an advanced management program from Harvard Business School. So he is truly a citizen of the world.
And surviving all weathers.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to make a comment about Singapore summers and London winters, but you know. Yeah, but no, that's even worse, is that he actually did spend some time in Switzerland also. So now that I've made all the weather jokes I can for this, what I'd like to start out with is that talking exactly about what are the key issues that are driving us now. And right now, Fred, I'm going to actually start out with you talking about, given the political uncertainties and a budget that was proposed initially by the White House that would significantly cut funds to the State Department. If I want to sell overseas, why do I need the federal government? Why is a well-funded U.S. State Department a key not only to trade and exports, but also for businesses? And what am I looking for here?
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I think that I spent 8 years as chairman of the Export-Import Bank, which is the United States Trade Bank, and we finance U.S. exports overseas, about 2/3 of developing countries, and sometimes it's hard countries to finance to, sometimes it's hard products, sometimes it's hard products to hard countries. And the State Department becomes really invaluable to American companies, whether you're a Boeing or a GE that has a lot of foreign expertise, or a small business. One of the small businesses not too far away, two of them actually, one here in Orange County and one down in Long Beach. One is an environmental company called Firm Green, and they're looking to sell, as an illustration, equipment that converts methane gas from a landfill into usable energy. Well, a lot of that work is with the government. And so when you're working in Asia and you're working in much of the world, the government has a large say in the purchase of those goods and services. And I think the ambassador from Singapore would probably echo that. So having a State Department that's got good relationships on the ground helps arrange and facilitate meetings with the finance minister or the infrastructure minister is an important thing. So when we look at cutting our State Department by 30%, what will go are the things that are cuttable. They're not going to be able to sell off embassies. They're not going to be closing embassies. What they will be doing is shrinking the workforce, shrinking the outreach, shrinking the local hires, all the kinds of people that American businesses, and particularly small businesses, rely on to help make those sales overseas. So this has, I think, a direct commercial impact on U.S. companies and a lot of companies right here in California. Firm Green is one I mentioned. Another company that's, by illustration, a company called Ceilings Plus, owned by a woman down in Long Beach, Nancy Mercolino. They install ceilings in athletic stadiums, concert halls, airports. And again, those are all frequently have heavy government engagement overseas. And we need our State Department to sort of help smooth the way and help advocate for those sales. So I think this has a real direct impact on businesses right here.
Thank you, Fred. Now, to build on that specifically, I wanted the opposite, well, say the opposite political perspective. So, Ashok, if you could talk a little bit about, given the void created by the White House's rejection of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what kind of collaboration is needed in its wake, and what benefits has Singapore seen from internationalization?
Well, thank you, Michael. And you said that California is the gateway to Asia. Well, Singapore is the bridgehead to California. So there's this very strong connection. And in many ways, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the White House has put aside for the moment, they are looking at other ways to engage with the region across in trade. There is this 100-day plan with China. There's talk of a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan. Singapore is in the happy position that we actually negotiated a free trade agreement with the United States more than 10 years ago. It was the first Asian country that the US did a free trade agreement. And in many ways, it was the guiding post for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and future agreements. It became that gold standard out of which the TPP emerged. And Singapore has played this very important role of trying to keep the US economically engaged in the Asia Pacific. We see it not just because of the economic benefits to Singapore and the rest of the region, but also the strategic benefits for the United States. You have a country like Singapore that became independent about 50 years ago. 50 years ago, we had no real industry, we had no real opportunities for development. It was focusing on the way that the US did business, the way that the US helped to set up rules that really moved us forward. Today, Singapore is the destination for the largest amount of US investments anywhere in the Asia Pacific. There are more US investments in Singapore than there are in India and China combined. Now that's a very dramatic number if you think about just the population differences. We have 5.5 million people. India and China have 2.3 billion people. But we have created an economic ecosystem that really mirrors the US economic ecosystem. Intellectual property protection, rule of law, and this have made it easier for businesses to do. So with the new administration, we have had engagements at all levels, and they're feeling their way of how do we shape economic structures that keep us engaged with the Asia Pacific. I don't see this as a stepping away from Asia, just putting aside the TPP. I think it's trying to find and make sure that where they may have felt that the trade has been unbalanced for the United States, let's fix it. And again, with Singapore, the US is in a happy position of having a very large surplus. So we can now talk in the next stages of collaboration.
That sounds good and very positive. Now, talk to a factor of where those linkages are also very important in what's actually happening, Pradeep, I was going to ask you is that what are the main factors that lure talented entrepreneurs and researchers to California, particularly from Asia, and what is any of that under threat?
So I think the main factor is opportunity, and the threats are several, right? So let's go to slide 1 if we can. And I just want people to have a perspective of, if you look at the number of Asians in this country, Asian students, it's been growing for the last 20 years or so. And the biggest number of those students, foreign students in this country are Asians. About 70% of them are either from India or China. And then go to slide 3 now. And then if you look at where do these students go, California is by far the largest, #1 state attracting Asian foreign students in this country. Texas, #2 in size, is less than half of California. So that tells you the impact that these Asian students are having in California and on California. In fact, in 2000, at the peak of dot-com boom, the statistic was more than half the companies being created had at least one founder from India or China in Silicon Valley. So that's the impact. Now that impact is happening partly because of the UC system. So let's go to UC San Diego with a $1.1 billion research budget. We are the driver in San Diego economy. And if you take the UC as a whole, 10% of the federal research comes from the UCs. So 10 UCs take 10% of the federal research. One state in the country out of 50 takes 10%. And that is a driver of the economy. So you can see that between a powerful educational enterprise and a powerful and welcoming immigration-oriented state, we have become a powerhouse in driving the tech phase of the world, actually, not just this country. So now what are the threats? Right now, there are two big threats. One is the state itself. The state legislature is going to force the UC system in the regions to limit the number of non-residents. It's going to happen in 10 days from now. And you will be watching this on TV. So that's going to be a threat because these students, we will have to limit the number of students coming in. Secondly, President Trump's budget basically kills the NIH, kills the NSF, kills a whole bunch of research. Even when it puts money into the DoD, it's putting money into so that Wilbur Ross can fire 59 missiles into Korea. That's where the money is going. It's not going into basic technology. So those are the two big threats, I think.
Well, the good news is, at least, is that that Congress decided to up the NIH budget by $2 billion, even in spite of the proposal.
That is true. So let's see where the fight goes.
Well, but one thing you did mention is the fact is the tremendous number of Chinese and Indian entrepreneurs who've come to California and fundamentally started these businesses. So that brings up a very important point, which is, given the tremendous growth that's been happening in China, why are Chinese firms so incredibly interested not only investing in overseas companies, but particularly in California? What are they looking for?
Sure, Kevin. Thanks for having me. I think, in the past, I think China has been labeled as the manufacturing factory of the world, right? But in the last decade or so, China has really driving the new growth with technology engine. So that has been the national focus as well. Then, in addition to the technology focus, then also they have a new initiative of globalization. So that's the main driver. So there's a lot of investment going to California, particularly given that's the center of the technology innovation. Silicon Valley, probably a majority of the company under Fortune 500 technology company are from Silicon Valley. So we, the Chinese company have been heavily focusing in leading edge technology, kind of marry the technology with the huge market back in China. So that's why there's a lot of tech company emerge as a leader because China leapfrog from from the past without a strong foundation of the technology. For instance, in the FinTech mobile payment world, China now is leading the world with Alibaba and Ant Financial, because there's no credit card foundation. There's no credit card platform exists in China in the past. That's why they leapfrog directly into the mobile payment. So that's why Chinese mobile payment market is probably 50 times of the scale than US. So that's just one example how that technology could kind of help China in leapfrogging and become the really the sample of the best collaboration between US and China. Yeah.
Well, it's clearly, we talked about the technology in terms of the mobile payments. The other thing that just to sort of building off of that is that, Fred, you talked about the green technology, is that what is there in terms of opportunities for areas in mobile, but also for green technology that you see in terms of how collaborations not only are being done right, but where the real opportunities are given the growth?
Sure. Yeah, and in the clean tech area is also tremendous growth, right? China has become, in multiple way, in the, for instance, in the renewable energy field. There's they're the largest solar module manufacturing vendors. 5 out of top 6 are from China. On the wind turbine manufacturing, China Goldwind is the #1 in the world. There's everybody observed the high-speed railway, that network of infrastructure has been #1 in the world. So all those areas with a huge collaboration from the U.S., right? For instance, solar itself, there's a huge innovation happening in Silicon Valley, and after that become commoditized, China kind of with that scale became the leader. So there's a wave of the collaboration in technology transfer back to China, and China supplies the huge component modules to the U.S. market.
Fred?
I would jump in and add, we have largely lost the solar industry to China, frankly. We have First Solar, we have a few other startups, but most of the solar world and solar panels are coming out of China. And I think that was a mistake we made. We should not be giving away leading technology. But where we still do lead and California is at the forefront, is in battery technology. And from my visiting companies up in Silicon Valley, and whether it's be Tesla and others in the whole area, the battery technology is going to make a huge difference because it really makes renewable energy-based power. Because if you can take the sun and take the wind and then store it and use it, and not dependent on when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing, that changes the whole dynamic about that. Makes a real dent in the need for nuclear, the need for fossil fuel. It's not going to replace it, but it begins to make real inroads in that area. And that's an area that there'd be great collaboration, I would think, between China and California, because for it to take full advantage of renewable energy, you really need to store the energy.
Yeah. Pradeep?
So actually, I wanted to add to that. So Fred, I think we had no choice but to lose solar industry to China. Because if you look at the semiconductor manufacturing base, we first lost it to Taiwan, which then moved to China. Now there's some in Middle East. So there was no two ways about it. So having said that, I think the great thing about that is that Chinese single-handedly brought the cost of solar down and made it competitive in the US. Because without that manufacturing base, without the vast deployment, I don't see the solar energy becoming as cheap as it is right now. So I think, we kind of find we need to be appreciative of what the Chinese have done in that industry in terms of scale.
One side thing I also note is that the great collaboration that's happening in battery tech, the greatest example you can think of in battery technology collaboration right now, which ironically is just over the border in Nevada, is the Tesla Gigafactory, which really is a collaboration between Tesla, who puts its name on it, and Panasonic, who of course is Japanese. Right. So it's so that element is already, for any of you who are planning to buy a Tesla Model 3, understand that without the Japanese collaboration, it's not happening. So to build off of that as well, when you're talking about universities and collaborating, is that how much have you found the benefits from collaborating with the overseas universities in Asia, and what kind of structures do you create for that?
So, about 10 years ago, I started in a very bullish way building campuses outside the country when I was at Carnegie Mellon. And I was so bullish on it, I thought it was going to change the world. And 10 years later, it's changed me, and it hasn't changed anything else. So for example, collaboration with Chinese, what I found is it starts up very well. We build a whole campus, then they stop paying because there's always a government reason to not pay, and then bad stuff happens after that. Collaboration with Japanese, with Koreans, with Africans, I find that it's very hard for America to send American students and American faculty out there, and that's what they're expecting. They're not expecting me to pick some random people and put out there. So I think the best thing to do is to keep at this collaboration game, but not be as ambitious as I was, because like I said, in that process, I changed. The world changed me instead of me changing the world. So,
Michael, if I can come in on this, because let me tell you about some of the partnerships that have worked in Singapore with US institutions, because I think we've had to relook at the model where the traditional model was setting up a satellite campus and then expecting it to work the way it does here in the United States. In Singapore, those early sort of collaborations didn't quite work, because then you ended up, what is the reason that I should go to a particular, say, UC San Diego in Singapore, when most people in Singapore can afford to send their children to San Diego anyway?
Yes.
What is the advantage of that? So we've relooked at this whole partnership process, and there are several that are examples. Firstly, our university, the National University of Singapore, has set up an overseas campus in San Francisco. Then they encourage their students to come and spend a year of their 4-year degree working at internships in San Francisco while going through class. And we found that very popular because students want to come and test out what's going on in Silicon Valley. On the flip side, for US students, there are very significant re-looking at teaching. There's a Singapore University of Technology and Design, which is a collaboration between MIT and a Chinese university and a Singapore university, that is re-looking at the teaching of engineering and architecture from a design perspective. A small campus, they take about 100 students a year. The students spend time out at MIT in China and in Singapore, and they're re-teaching it. And you go and speak to the faculty over there, they said you could not do these things in a traditional, very silo-based university that says engineering is separate from architecture. They just had to re-look at that. There's a liberal arts school with our university that Yale has set up, the Yale NUS Liberal Arts School, teaching not just the traditional canon of Western civilization, but also bringing Eastern civilization. Right. What do you need to learn about Confucius and Hinduism, even as you learn about the Greeks and the Romans? So these are different types of collaborations that we have brought in. Duke has set up a medical faculty in Singapore, just re-looking at how they can teach medicine in Singapore. We already have a very good medical school in Singapore, but it's undergraduate medical school from the British model. The Duke model comes in as a postgraduate medical system. How do we do better research? So we found that these small types of partnerships are really working better than just putting a satellite campus in place.
So can I add to that? So I think this works because the Singaporean government has been very forward-looking and has invested significant amounts of money into these collaborations. On the other hand, if you look at the Australian university that tried to set up a campus in Singapore, it fell apart, right? And the same model in the Middle East works because the Qatari government and the Abu Dhabi is extremely generous and they're putting a lot of money, so these collaborations work. But the moment the money goes away, the collaboration goes away, and that's my point. So it's not self-sustaining ecosystem that's been built as yet.
And well, since it's not self-sustaining, that leaves a situation yet. But what that does leaves is still a situation where a lot of foreign students are particularly coming here into the United States. And now, you certainly came to the United States once upon a time. Elise came to the United States once upon a time. Is it, particularly with now, admittedly, neither of you originally came to California. You wound up here eventually, anyway. So, but what's the kind of draw that particularly is bringing foreign students here, and is there anything that's particularly making that under threat, even beyond the limitations imposed by the state?
So I think I came here primarily to do my grad studies, and I knew when I came here that this is where I wanted to live because of the opportunity. I'm not talking just money and a job, but a career opportunity where you could be working in the high-tech field. The universities, the companies, the industry, everything around was pushing technology, and high-tech was where it was. Unlike in other developed countries where there might be high-tech industry, but the government is not that high-tech, or there's high-tech in the military and the industry is not high-tech, right? So this is where the opportunity was, and that's why I came here. Secondly, when you were highly qualified, the ability to get a green card was very good, which is not the case. For example, I had a Rhodes Scholarship, and I refused to go to the UK because I didn't think the treatment was that good. Partly because of the history, right? And this country, I thought, was accepting of anybody and everybody who was able and willing to contribute to society. I think, fast forward, this is like 35 years ago, this is 1980. Fast forward to 2017, I don't know if I would come here now. I really don't, because I think other countries in the world, Australia, Singapore is a great example, New Zealand, have much more open doors, equally good opportunity, low risk when it comes to immigration, and better integration, right? So I don't think I would. I personally would still come here, but I'm telling you, we are seeing the foreign student applications are going down. I think the country, because of its outlook right now, statements that are being made, and immigration policies, we talk about these immigrants taking our jobs. Lack of immigration is going to not create jobs anymore, and the jobs will be gone anyway. So.
Yeah, I think Silicon Valley actually, the reason it's so great is because it's driven by immigration, the culture, the spirit, right? The hungriness by immigrant, the creativity. So I think all the Chinese students are still, kind of coming here strongly, right? I was told that about 320,000 Chinese students in the U.S. Universities are studying now. And in fact, all the tech company, if you count all the top leading technology company, all the CTO and all the major technology innovation are driven by the returnees. We call it sea turtle in China because they are all studying U.S. and work with Microsoft, IBM, Oracle in the past. So all the technology wave are driven by the returnees. Right. So I think that's a still very strong wave. A lot of Chinese students are still coming here, even though they go back with the tightened immigration policy. But that's foster the collaboration even more.
Actually, I want to put this in perspective. The total number of Indians and Chinese in the U.S. Anybody want to guess? It's less than
Million?
3. It's less than 3%.
Yeah.
Like 1% Indian and less than 2% Chinese. So you can see the amplification effect. So if you live in California, you think the country is made of Indians and Chinese, which is not true.
Now, two things just as sort of corollaries off of that. First, Fred, is that one of the key things is that for entrepreneurs have been actually not only a key for in sort of identifying California as being this great center of innovation, but also what we're talking about is that California used to be the leading exporter in the U.S. and ironically NAFTA set up Texas to take over that spot. But as California continues to be more facing towards the Pacific Rim, why are these entrepreneurs, especially the foreign-born ones, really important, especially in terms of exports, and what opportunities do they create that might not be there otherwise?
Here in California, per se. Well, I mean, California still is a very innovative economy, and I know that sounds somewhat obvious on the surface, but if you just look at mobile phones in this room, I mean, in terms of satellite technology, they're made here. Boeing, L'Oreal, SpaceX, those are all big exporters from the United States. And so that innovation certainly drives a lot of employment here, and that innovation and those kind of companies have a lot of spin-offs as a result of that, and a lot of related technologies. So I think that, you know, when in terms of, I'm more focused on what we export, but clearly investment is looking at innovation, and that we still lead the world in sort of innovative thinking, innovative products. People in this country are celebrated for taking a risk. That's not always true in many other cultures. So that makes this a very attractive place for sort of foreigners to come to invest and to sort of also try things out.
What you have, Michael, on the other side is a population that wants US-style products. They want to have the mobile phones that you speak about in their pocket. There are competitors coming in. And speaking of ASEAN, the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, which are working very closely to integrate themselves much more as an ASEAN economic community, that's a population of 625 million. Their GDP, combined GDP is about 3.5 trillion. The California GDP by itself is about 2.5 trillion. But there are, because of just going across the Pacific, there are ways in which California can connect much better with that. Putting across ideas of innovation, getting your companies to grow markets over there. And that's what we have seen happen, whether it is companies from here moving in or using California as the base to go across. This could be in technology. E-commerce, for example, Southeast Asia, notwithstanding the fact that you are fairly closely connected, actually Southeast Asia is very underrepresented on e-commerce. These are new ideas can come in, payment systems, but if you don't do that, there are going to be other alternative ideas coming in. Alibaba is entering Southeast Asia. We're not seeing US equivalents coming in, and you will lose an opportunity. It is a complicated geography in Southeast Asia, but we're really trying to pull it together, and I think the US coming in, helping to set up these rules, how do you set up payment systems? I think these are opportunities for the future.
And the question is that are we positioned to do that? And if we're still inward looking, how are we actually going to do that?
I think your entrepreneurs are actually positioned to do that because they want to look at new markets. The US is still the most attractive market, but we have in fact set up an accelerator space in San Francisco called Block 71 San Francisco. In Singapore, it's a large incubator space called Block 71. We set up a offshoot in San Francisco. It helps not just Singapore entrepreneurs enter the United States, but also others from Southeast Asia, because we really see our role as becoming that regional hub, connecting with other cities in the region entering in. But it also becomes a space where US entrepreneurs can come in there, try out their products, and then say, I'll go across the Pacific. Because it gives them an entree into understanding what the Asian demand is. Asians use their mobile phones differently from the way Americans use mobile phones. It may be the same technology, but we are using it very differently. How do you test out an app without going necessarily across the Pacific, test it out in this accelerator. So we're looking at how we can get these collaboration things going. Now, the bigger projects, the infrastructure opportunities are always there, whether you're speaking about high-speed rails, whether you're speaking about new developments, and you do have a lot of that infrastructure opportunities to go into the region. It's just taking the lead and saying we need to be out there. Obviously, it will be supported by putting in frameworks, trade agreements, and other things like that. But even without that, people have been going across.
Absolutely, and I will say this as just as a personal example that I was told that my mobile phone was useless when I was in Beijing last time unless I had WeChat, not only to talk but also to pay and everything else. So it really is different in terms of how you view it and how you utilize it. Now, Fred, that brings up one thing is that you're talking about culturally getting the entrepreneurs to export. Why is trade financing? Why is getting these businesses ready to export? How do you convince them? These entrepreneurs, if they want to be global, how do you make them actually do it?
Well, one of the things I discovered in my time at Exim Bank, when I was in business, we looked at exporting after you sort of saturated the local market. And the small businesses that I met looked at exporting virtually as part of their day one business plan. It was looking at the world much more globally from the start, not after you've exhausted all local opportunities. So that's number one. Number two, small businesses always have a couple of strikes against them. One is they're small, and if they're small and they're exporting, that's 2 strikes. So there's not a lot left. And that's really where I was proud of the work we did at the Export-Import Bank, because 90% of our customers were small. And usually it's the banks that would bring them in, would essentially bring us in. The bank would say, this is too risky, this is out of our strike zone, this is a little too risky for us, but with an Export-Import Bank guarantee from the US government, we can make that project work. And essentially what we did when I was chairman of the Export-Import Bank is essentially we sell an insurance policy to the bank. We'll insure that loan, you pay us a premium like you buy health insurance, fire insurance, you pay us a premium, and for that we guarantee the loan, and then the bank made the loan. We let a lot of small businesses really tap into global markets that otherwise would be impossible for them.
Now, on the flip side, of course, is that China has actually been great at figuring out how to get their small businesses to export. One of the things that you mentioned in terms of just FinTech, but also to go with that e-commerce, is that what are the kind of innovations in that regards in terms of getting Chinese businesses, small businesses, and getting them engaged to California, and what kind of innovations do you think that could then be utilized where the Chinese could teach the California businesses to go the other way around?
Sure. I think China really has been leading the FinTech, e-commerce, mobile payment area, right? So use just, for instance, just one example of Ant Financial, which is a subsidiary of Alibaba. The company was founded in 2014. So now today they have 450 million users, right? Annual active users. That kind of scale. They also expand aggressively globally. They acquire HelloPay in Southeast Asia. India, they acquire PayTV, and recently acquired MoneyGram. It's a 1.2 billion acquisition in the US. So they are integrating the worldwide user base, make it a powerhouse. So that kind of scale, I think, they kind of came much later than any of the PayPal or US incumbent in before. So we are seeing that wave coming to artificial intelligence as well. US has been AI research for 60 years, but China kind of leapfrogging again. So they set up an AI center in Seattle recently. They hire, the guy, they have a big center already in Palo Alto. Then they hire a top researcher from Microsoft to lead the AI practice. Then they open up the entire, like for instance, one Baidu. Baidu is a company doing the search, which is a Google version of Chinese version. But they recently opened up the entire autonomous car platform. Okay. This became an open platform. A lot of U.S. counterpart has spent a lot of money investing in that, but they opened up for free for all the car manufacturer to integrate, use their software platform, use their hardware platform. So they kind of open this, the waiting to collaborate to become the global leader. That driver is really huge. So that's something I think the U.S. counterpart need to look at different way as well.
So actually, I don't mean to pick up a fight with my fellow panelists, right? But no, seriously, it's actually
lively.
It's a serious issue.
Yeah.
if you look at AI, you look at the internet, you look at all sorts of IT, the U.S. for more than 60 years has been perpetually investing year after year after year, investing money to build universities, investing money to train foreign students like me and others, including Chinese students, including American students, building the technology, building companies. That's how Google came out. And now for India and China, where they lucked out in 2000, where if you look at, for example, Google, there's Baidu. You look at security companies, there's Tencent. You look at, for every IT company here, there's a similar Chinese IT company there. But then you ask yourself, where was that Chinese university PhD? Where was that student? How much was the government investment? And you find it all came from here. And I think at some point, we need to be careful because this country can only afford so much in R&D to keep up the world going. And India and China need to step it up and start investing money and open up their IP and open up their universities and be open in publications like this country has. I mean, a lot of the good fortune in the world right now is because of this country's investment post-World War II, starting with the Marshall Plan, right? And now it's time for other countries to step it up. And I just am trying to contain the enthusiasm of China taking over only because there's money that was made from technology that came from this country at one point.
Yeah, add on to that point, I actually, we have to think a different angle because the China way of globalization actually who benefit most, right? Consumer, right? So when the e-commerce become a global network, everybody in the U.S. also benefited from the, the kind of flow, e-commerce flow, and also the convenience of the payment. I think we have to think about how that,
okay.
yeah.
Well, then let's look at manufacturing in China and see if the Chinese government is willing to let the manufacturing go to Indonesia. And you will, no, seriously, or Philippines, because these are the countries that are waiting to grab the low-end manufacturing and step it up. And it's not clear to me that's going to happen.
All right, well then, okay, well, how do you, I'm curious because Singapore has to navigate this entire mess. So.
Well, we are in a very different, we have small geography, small workforce, we're very limited. So what we've had to do is to move up the value curve. The old style manufacturing, when you needed jobs 50 years ago, that has had to change. The way we've done it is we've partnered with international companies, whether from California, the United States, or anywhere else around the world, to help move up the value chain. If you're talking about artificial intelligence, if you're talking about robotics, you do require a very well-trained workforce. We do have that workforce, and that's what brings people in. But what we've also done is collaborated very closely with the companies as they come in to say, let's look at the next 5 and 10 years. Let's not just look at the jobs you're creating today for what I need, but what do you need for the next 5 or 10 years? And these are the conversations I have every time I come to California and meet CEOs over here. The ongoing collaboration is excellent, but we know that given the changing regional supply chains, the changing technology, we really have to look ahead. So what you have now in Singapore is companies setting up innovation centers, setting up ideas around cybersecurity, for example, that is not really the grunt work, but the much more higher value work. And what we have tried to get our workforce ready for these things. It means continuous education. It means that universities no longer stop at the age of 23 or 24 and say that you're going to spend the next 40 years based on the education I gave you up to the age of 20. There's a continuous process of education, whether it's using universities, whether it's using our polytechnics to say, you just need to keep upgrading yourself. And that's really the future we see. Otherwise, you're always going to be left behind. And just looking back at last year's technology and say, that's the technology I'm best at.
But also you have significant investment in R&D.
Yes.
Government investment. And that's the point I'm making. So Biopolis would not exist just because of universities. It exists because of Singaporean government.
We have a very large fund for research, innovation, enterprise.
Exactly.
And the idea being is not just about innovation, which fortunately the US has that capacity to do, but it's how do you then take it to market? How do you commercialize that? And that becomes a lot more useful to companies as they partner to us. We'll work with you to research, we'll co-invest with you, we'll help you set up the research institutes, but let's take the next step and get them into the markets as well.
So then one of the things that's particularly been important for California and California firms is this commercialization, is that Singapore is basically taking the lead in stepping up on commercialization. Silicon Valley was fundamentally built around Stanford and the IP that came out of Stanford, and not just, as famously, not just Stanford itself, but also the Xerox Research Park and various other facilities
Berkeley.
there.
And Berkeley.
Oh, and Berkeley. And Berkeley. But let's be honest, is that for some reason people decided that when they were going to start their firms, they tended to do it a little further south
Exactly.
in the bay. But that being said, there are efforts to try and replicate that technology transfer. Singapore is clearly taking the lead in trying to create its own Singaporean effort at a Silicon Valley, or rather just its own Singaporean institutions. But why? LA is clearly trying, has its Silicon Beach, which is more about entertainment technology. San Diego fundamentally had a significant advantage in not only UC San Diego's presence, but also the research institutes and the technology transfer and the life sciences. The big question that coming out of this, if tech transfer and commercialization is a key, what should the universities and the governments and the various actors be doing to try and continue to push that along? And what are the factors you're seeing right now that are slowing it or stopping it? Fred, when something's commercialized, how do what needs to be done to get it to be a global phenomenon rather than just local?
Well, I mean, partly simplistically, global ambitions have a lot to do with it, and that is really thinking globally, thinking in terms of how your product would fit in an other environment than our own, whether that goes to product naming as well as utility and so forth, and something that the ambassador said, just how people use cell phones and mobile phones are different in different environments, so having that understanding. And obviously, I would add obviously just the financial wherewithal to do that, and a lot of local banks are reluctant to do that. So that is why the federal government has a role. The Export-Import Bank goes back to the 1930s when FDR, in order to put more people to work, said if we're going to try and put more people to work, we need to be selling abroad because that's one way to amplify the work that's done in America and hire more Americans. That was true in 1934 and it's true today. So part of that is there is a definite role for the federal government to play. I know that's an unpopular statement since January 20th, but there is a role for the federal government to play in furthering those exports and furthering the jobs that they support.
Kevin, if I can just come in here. Silicon Valley is unique. Singapore can never replicate Silicon Valley. I'm very realistic about it. I spent 10 days ago, I spent a day in Silicon Valley with venture capitalists, and I do that very regularly. It is really a unique environment because you do have the university, you do have the financial sector, and you do have students that are very driven. You want to get to Stanford or Berkeley and say, I really want to start my own startup. I no longer want to work for a global multinational, even if it's an American multinational. I want to try this. This whole idea of accepting failure is actually very unique to Silicon Valley. In Asia, failure has always been looked at as a negative. And we still have to change. The laws have to change in order to say failure is a lot more acceptable. But here, you celebrate failure. You're looking for people who failed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, because then the next thing is going to be the unicorn. So it's a very unique place. And not least, when we started talking about weather, the weather in Silicon Valley is much better than most of the rest of the world. So that's a big advantage. Except San Diego. Yes, but then what I think Silicon Valley needs to do is to stretch those tentacles out a lot more. Right. I suspect in all my meetings, I find them a little bit too inward looking. You come to me, and otherwise I just don't have the time to go to you. So if they can look out and say, from there we're going to spread our tentacles out, because there are secondary cities. It's not just Beijing, Shanghai, Singapore, Bangkok. There are secondary cities in China, in Southeast Asia, where that person looking for a new startup may actually find opportunities. And that's quite a unique way of doing things.
So I think in the US that's happening, right? So if you look at, for example, New York, which was basically the financial capital, is now becoming the FinTech capital. Between NYU and Columbia and Mayor Bloomberg, they're doing deals where New York is becoming really just like a mini Silicon Valley, and I've been there, and it's exciting. You look at the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, that is actually a very vibrant hub. You look at Pittsburgh, from a steel city, it's become like the software city and the medtech city. You look at Boston, which was known for its universities, is now known for biotech. San Diego, known for Navy, is now known for biotech. So I think there's a lot of cities in the U.S. that have figured out how to do this. It's not scaled enough, but I'm very bullish about a lot of smaller cities taking lead in this.
Right. Basically figuring out their spot, not trying to be everything.
Exactly, right. And creating jobs and creating technology and using the universities in their midst. So there's a property in these cities. No city is a great city without at least a very good to a great university in it, right? And I think this is where the rest of the world has not figured out how to use their universities. So for example, you go to Bologna, one of the oldest universities. As a town, it's nothing. You go to Venice. No, seriously, it's a good tourist town, but in terms of technology, in terms of job creation, in terms of cutting edge, you go to Oxford, Cambridge, it's the same story again. They haven't figured out how to really utilize the existence of great universities. This country has.
But actually, add to that, I found China, Israel, have certain degree of success, duplicating Silicon Valley model, right? In China, from provincial level to city level, they have a lot of incubating with capital injection, with government support. That's why Hangzhou, where Alibaba born, become really a smart city where a lot of big companies kind of born there, built around the Zhejiang University, Shanghai, Fudan University around there. So I think that model actually, as long as you have that kind of immigration culture, open to people coming to the city with the creativity, with the capital support, that itself can be very successful.
Right.
In fact, Shenzhen in China become the next Silicon Valley because all the Tencent, Huawei were born there, and DJI, which is the largest drone manufacturer, also there, right? So became a hub of the IoT, innovation center as well. So we are seeing different pockets of success duplicating Silicon Valley around the world.
Yeah. And that actually to some degree brings up a point that was made to me about last time I was in China, was the fact that Shenzhen was basically viewed as the software center, that but that if you wanted that Hangzhou had gotten a certain amount of entrepreneurship, and that Shanghai was the center for the harder sciences.
Yes,
so
semiconductor,
Yes, and so in that specialization is essentially what is occurring. They're not trying to be everything. Well, I think there's some people in Shenzhen who would like to be everything, but but that success is coming in different places.
Absolutely.
So now, one of the other key things that comes up is given, we keep talking about the need for, Pradeep talks about the need for everybody to do their share in terms of funding R&D, but that whole issue of R&D funding from the federal government level has been under threat. You talked about the proposals for that. In so many ways, the targeted R&D funding in the U.S. has been fundamentally in decline since the late 1960s. Right. Essentially, we got to the moon, and then we suddenly said, okay, we did that, and we cut back a lot of our more advanced risky science funding. Who's going to be driving the great R&D innovations at this point? I mean, some of it, other governments can step in, but where's this money coming from, and can it effectively come from the private sector, or does it need to come cross-border?
So first of all, I think every country has a responsibility to take part of their budget. Just like they put money in defense, R&D is economic defense. It is their responsibility to do this, and they have not done it up to now, partly because of fluidity of IP and lack of IP protection, and stealing IP is not considered as bad as killing somebody's soldier. So, but nonetheless, the world is changing, so that has to happen. Within the US, the feds are disinvesting, there's no doubt about it, and I think companies have to start investing. If you look at the major US companies, used to be a time when 8 Bell Labs was like better than any government lab in the country. Nobel laureates, transistor was invented there, feedback was invented there, fundamental contributions gone. IBM TJ Watson was a leading place, nearly gone. I mean, it's all applied now. So there are, GE was a great place, gone. I can go down the list between the large companies going and their R&D labs going. Now we have places like Google and Microsoft and others investing in R&D, but primarily by grabbing groups of faculty or groups of small company and basically buying them out. And that's not the way to build an ecosystem of and a great research environment, right? So I think industry has a role to play. They are playing a role, but they have a bigger role to play. And universities also have to open up their minds and work more with industry and not say, give me the money and get out of here and come back after 5 years. We need to be more collaborative from the university side.
All right. Ashok?
Well, you know, it's important that research has to take place. I think you cannot just rely on government. Around the world, government budgets are getting a lot more constricted. It's getting then private companies to say we want to do more, but do it in a collaborative fashion. FinTech has been a very interesting example because you had your traditional banks and financial institutions that had to operate around very strict regulatory environments. They cannot innovate because of the regulations. But then what they have done, they have partnered with smaller companies and said, let's create sandboxes where you can try these things. And Singapore's created a regulatory sandbox where large companies, the banks, can come in and work with smaller players and say, let's try something new within a unique regulatory environment that you're not going to impact the whole system. And that's a new way of doing things. It's not just going to be funded from the big companies. We'll look for smaller partners. We'll look to places where we can try some of these things, where we can look at new test models, test beds, and then after that see whether we can take it much wider. We have a Smart Nation project in Singapore, which actually welcomes US multinationals to come in there and try out whether it's FinTech, whether it's autonomous vehicles, in very smaller environments, and then throw them out in a much larger environment. So I think it has to be partnerships between the companies who understand what the needs may be, what their current expectations are, and then looking for smaller players who can come in and try things out. Then if government creates the right infrastructure and all those other elements of it, then I think it can work.
Elise?
Yeah, I don't. Actually, I observed Stanford working very closely with a lot of venture capitalists, right? So that could be a model, because the reason Stanford is so successful is they work very closely with those funding source, right? Whatever need to be commercialized, they have capital ready for backing the C stage companies, right? So that could be a model for a lot of other university to follow, right? Building up so that I observed some of the Southern California venture fund now working with UCSD, you know, with USC, with a lot of research centers starting to incubate some of the C project. I see that's a wave also happening in China, right? China probably government take more R&D initiative, right? Recently they launched the National AI Lab, which will be led by Baidu, by a company. They launched the Semiconductor National IC Fund, which is a 22 billion fund that's going to support all the semiconductor project. So there's some way of government, coming in to support the R&D, and meanwhile with the commercial way of working with venture capital or PE firm. Yeah.
Yeah. I would just throw in, I think when companies or countries build things together, they form much more enduring relationships. So to the extent whether it's a research project, whether it's a power plant, whether it's a new communication system, but when you have people in a country working together, people often say the only way to get to know somebody is to marry them or work with them. Well, you can't marry everybody, but by working with them, I think we get a much deeper understanding of other cultures, how they operate, and form, for the United States, at the end of the day, far more durable ties. I'm going to go, since I'm no longer working with the government, give you an example. I think, our ties in countries where we've had collaborations, where students have come here so that they're American-trained students who are living, whether it's in the Mideast, whether it's in Singapore, whether it's in India, are much stronger ties than when we don't have that, because That's how people, if you spend 4 years at a university here, or in a research project here, or building a product together, those become, you understand, you don't just look at the headlines, you don't just default to the stereotypes about one culture or another, but you actually have your own set of experiences. So I think that at the end of the day, finding ways to forge these and encourage them makes us a much stronger country at the end of the day. It actually makes us not a stronger country, a more stable country, and a far more prosperous place at the end of the day.
Now, one thing that has been marked is that we, in some ways, you need to be. We're in a very dynamic time. A lot of changes are happening. What would be one thing that could be particularly done to? I can't quite say future-proof because it's not. You can't quite future-proof anything. But if we're going to, what would be the one thing you feel like the step could be done, either at the government or the business level, to sort of adapt to the changes in the Pacific Rim that are going on right now? If there's one thing you think people should be focusing on.
Yes,
yeah. Right.
Well, I'll be very parochial. Since I chaired the Export-Import Bank, the president needs to nominate a full board so it can go fully operational. At the peak of the financial crisis, when I was there, we did $36 billion worth of loans. Last year, my last year at the bank, did about $5 billion because, frankly, being hobbled without a full board. The last time the bank did that little money was 40 years ago. So if we want to be engaged in Asia, we want to have companies in California and the United States selling over there, engaging over there, we need to make sure they have the financing to do so. So that would be one thing I would do.
Elise?
I think still back to our topic, collaboration. Right, I think that's the key must-have for all the companies, even from day one, to think with the global perspective, right? Because then now, otherwise you'll be left out. I really see that happening all over the world. I think anybody cannot isolate yourself from the world. I think collaboration is really the key. Thank you.
I would say keep our higher education strong and keep our universities open to all sorts of students from all sorts of countries.
I'd like to see the California government take a much more forward-looking view. The governor, the mayors, senators, members of Congress from California, recognizing that you have a multi-ethnic, diverse population here in California, many from Asia. The first place that they come into, start sending missions out, start understanding what's going on over there, and then create these new partnerships. And so whether it's about city sustainability, whether it's about innovation, how can LA work with Southeast Asia? How can LA work with China? How can create these regional links? Because in Asia, the most important thing first is the face-to-face contact, is that personal relationship before you can build everything else. And I think that's where the California government can look ahead and say, okay, we don't have a broader trade agenda, but what can we do as California to reach across the Pacific?
Thank you, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a wonderful panel, and thank all of you for attending. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of the day at the Global Conference.